Any Bible questions before we get started? Whew. James chapter 4 then. James chapter 4. We're in James 4 verse 11. But just as a reminder of where we've been, we're going to read James chapter 4 and just verse 1, which says, "What is the source of quarrels and conflicts among you? Is not the source your pleasures that wage war in your members?" So I just wanted to bring again to your attention the arrogance that some of those that, to whom James was writing had, and the fighting that had been going on, and as we're going to see in this passage, the judging that had been going on between these individuals. And we'll see that here in verse 11, okay? So just keep in mind that we're not reading verse 11 and 12 in a vacuum. These are themes that James has already introduced in the book, and he's just continuing the discussion that he began in chapter 1 and verse 1. So let's go right here to verse 11 and let's read. He says, "Do not speak against one another, brethren. He who speaks against a brother or judges his brother speaks against the law and judges the law. But if you judge the law, you are not a doer of the law, but a judge of it. There is only one lawgiver and judge, the one who is able to save and to destroy. But who are you who judge your neighbor?" Anybody have any just quick thoughts on this passage?
I feel like it's used out of context a lot of times. I guess in today and probably times past, people tend to want to categorize truth as a judgment.
Okay.
You know what I mean? So
Right.
like, if you call somebody out on something that is wrong, instead of them, examining themselves and, it's automatically you're judging me.
Right. And the idea there is that judgment automatically brings with it ill will, like you're attacking them or you're wishing harm upon them or something like that, or you're trying to hurt them is what's typically thought. When we look at judgment in this context, though, in James chapter 4, you can already see in verse 1 that this is not righteous judgment at all. They're not testing all spirits or trying all spirits, as John urges the church to do in 1 John chapter 4 and verse 1. As Jesus says in Matthew 7, they're not judging righteous judgment here. Instead, this is the kind that's not intended to lift up, but it's intended to break down and to harm. And we'll take a look at some of the passages that deal with that in a second. Anybody else have any thoughts, though, before we continue? All right, let's read verse 11 again. He says, "Do not speak against one another, brethren." Now, again, we know this is not talking about in the realm of honest correction or good intended discipline, but this is meant to hurt and to blaspheme and to slander, right? This goes back to verse 1. What is the source of quarrels and conflicts among you? And he talks about in verse 2, them committing murder and fighting and quarreling and all these sorts of things. And so verse 11, the "do not speak against one another, brethren," does not mean speaking against false teaching or calling out someone who is trying to intentionally lead people astray or whatever it is, but it's specifically in the context of hateful, mean-spirited, arrogant type of judgment that he's been discussing all along. So he says, "Do not speak against one another," and then he adds on that word at the end there, "brethren," which I pointed out to you before, I think speaks to the audience of this passage. I don't believe he's using, while it's not eliminated or excluded, I don't think he's using the word brother here in the Christian sense, like we might say, Brother Johnny or Brother Jimmy or something like that, but he's using the word brother here in a kinsmanship sense. Remember, he's writing, as we learned in James chapter 1, he's writing in verse 1 there, to the 12 tribes who are dispersed abroad, greeting. And he addresses them as brothers throughout the passage. And we've seen even Paul do this when he was standing before people who weren't Christians. He addressed them as men and brethren. And so I think James is primarily speaking to a Jewish audience, and that's why he's using this expression brethren so much. Did you have something, Jaden? Oh, you're just scratching? You gotta be careful about scratching that ear. And also keep in mind that we're about to see this passage here in a second, and from James chapter 2. But James, when he talks about judging the law, he's talking about the law. He's talking about the law of Moses. And we're going to see that here in a moment, in what passage he's actually referring to. Okay? Anybody have any comments on that real quick?
I don't know if that had it. Anyway, you sometimes you say something about someone that's true. And everyone, well, I can't say everyone knows it's true, but normally it's true.
Right.
And another person will say, well, it may be true, but is it expedient?
See, that's a good point. You can judge correct. You can be technically correct in a judgment that you make without judging righteously. We're going to see that here in a second from Romans chapter 14. So you can be technically correct about an issue, but not be judging correctly. Because you do it with the wrong attitude or hatefully or with the intention to hurt the person and not to lift them up, not to and. Some people might say, well, that's what they're trying to do. They're trying to show them the error of their ways. But there's a time for throwing over tables in the temple. But most of the time, Jesus was, patient even with the people who were going to reject him,
I was watching a movie last night, and the lady said the lady had gotten raped, and she was an older lady, like older lady.
Right.
So when they found the guy, they say, well, you can forget about it now. So she said, you forget she told the guy that she forgive him. So the lawyer said, well, you can forgive. The lady said, you can forgive, but you never forget. But some people say, you forget this thing. But if it's if it's recorded in your brain, you don't forget it. And when something comes up that kicks it off, reminds you of that, you think about that thing. Some people say, well, you never did forget.
Right.
Or you never did forgive. So I think, I don't know, what you think?
Let's go to Matthew. Go to Matthew 23 for a second. Go to Matthew 23. In Matthew 23 and verse, verse 30. Verse 30 says, if we had been living in the days of our fathers, we would not have been partners with them in shedding the blood of the prophets. All right, so basically what they're saying is, our fathers shed the blood of the prophets, and that was wrong. Okay. Shedding the blood of the prophets is one of the reasons why Jerusalem was destroyed in 586 BC, and the people of Judea were taken into Babylon for 70 years. That's one of the reasons why they went, because they rejected the prophets and even killed them for that. Okay? In Jeremiah, and in Ezekiel, and in Daniel, and in Ezra, and in Nehemiah, all those chapters are filled with people praying, for forgiveness. Bring us back to the land. The book of Psalms has it all over. Bring us back to the land. We're weeping by the willows in Babylon, and we want to come back home to our land in Judea. And so, whenever God sends them back, that's him forgiving them, right? And yet, in this passage, Jesus brings that sin back up when he realizes that these people are about to do the same thing. He says, you're about to do the same things your forefathers did. Or here's another. All through the New Testament, he says, don't do what they did back in the times of the wilderness, or be careful what they did back in these times, or whatever. And so, if God forgave the people that asked for forgiveness, if he forgave those things, then why did he remember them? And here's another. We have the sins of David recorded in the Bible, but David prayed for forgiveness. If God forgot it, why would he inspire it to be written down if he forgot it? So it doesn't, forgive and forget doesn't mean to mentally erase it from your brain. That's not something that can be done, especially with something as awful as the case that you mentioned on the movie last night. What forgive and forget means is to forgive and to no longer hold it to their charge. And don't hold it to their charge. Now, if that man that did that, she can't just forget that, and if he comes knock on her door, she can't just say, oh yeah, come on in, everything's fine, I forgave and forgot, because that would be ridiculous, and why would God expect you to do something like that? What forgive and forget means, though, is to just not hold that sin to their charge any longer. Now, you can still keep a respectful distance or whatever. A husband might divorce his wife if she cheated on him, or even though he forgave her, there's a difference between the way that the Bible uses that word forgive and forget and the way that we use the word forget, and I forgot where my car keys were, or I forgot the answer for the test. And when you think about the idea of forgetting, the idea of forgetting in our sense contradicts one of the three terms that we use to help us understand who God is. We have omnipresent, we have omnipotent, but we also have omniscient. And if God is all-knowing, right, if God is all-knowing, how could he forget? But the idea there isn't that mentally he forgets. It's all included. All he had to do is just read the Bible. If God knows what the Bible says, every time we read the scriptures, he remembers what the sins are there. But the idea is he doesn't hold them to the people's charge. That's the idea. It's impossible to forget some of the sins that have been committed against you. You can go to camps with monks and all that and try to do meditations and cold walks and all that to try to forget it, and you might be able to find a place that'll let you do that, or maybe a bunch of drugs or something, or what's it called? What they cut out a lobotomy. Yeah, you can get a lobotomy. Yeah, do what? But that's not what God means when he says forgive and forget. He just means don't hold it to their charge. He's not gonna. We're really bad about this. You get in a fight with somebody, arguing with them, and suddenly all those things you forgave them for, here they come out one after the other, even though you apparently already forgave them, for that. So, so just that's my 2 cents on it. Saying that forget means mentally erase, there's not a person in the world that can follow that command. So he says, do not speak against one another, brethren. All right, let's go to Romans 14 for just a second. Look at verses 3 and 4. Romans 14, 3 and 4 says this: the one who eats is not to regard with contempt the one who does not eat. And the one who does not eat is not to judge the one who eats, for God has accepted him. Now, are one of those people technically correct, right? The one who eats, who's willing to eat any kind of meat or whatever, clean or unclean, he's technically okay in doing that thing, right? But that does not give him the ability or the permission to criticize or view his brother with contempt who doesn't eat. And here's what he says in verse 4. Who are you to judge the servant of another? To his own master he stands or falls, and he will stand, for the Lord is able to make him stand. So regardless if he eats or doesn't eat, keeps a day or doesn't keep a day, that's not the point. The point is how does he stand with God? And so this is similar to what we have in James 4, verse 11. Now, he doesn't say that if a person is saying that, Jesus isn't the Son of God, then that's just his opinion. That's not the point that he's making. He's talking about matters of, matters of, I don't know if indifference is the right word, but matters of opinion. If God makes all food clean, you can still go on a diet if you want to. You're not rejecting God's will by not eating all food. You might have something you're allergic to or something you don't prefer, right? But if God makes all food clean, that doesn't mean that you can judge the one who does eat all things, right?
And that judgment can go the other way too, because some people that do the restricted diets or only are vegetarians or whatever, sometimes they can be kind of condemning to people who do partake in everything. So it can
Right.
go to both extremes,
Yep, that's right. Lillian.
Yeah, and sometimes, some people in the church, in the Lord's church, they'll condemn you for putting up a Christmas tree. But this would be a good thing for them, You want putting up a Christmas tree.
Putting up a Christmas tree at all or in the church building? Like at all or even in your house?
In your house.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, my great granddaddy was totally against that. I'm told
I think so, because it does say that one regards one day over the other, one regards every day the same. But if we can get the world to think more about Jesus just one day out of a year, I think that's a good thing, not a bad thing. Because even if it's any publicity is good publicity, is what some people say. Johnny, what?
Christmas tree, but I don't celebrate it for Christ's birthday. I just like wiggling lights like that.
Right. Johnny?
No, I'm saying that passage that you read in Hebrews, speaking to those that are weak in the faith.
Yes.
You have to be patient with those people. I can approach them or what you're saying or whatever.
Right.
Like it means like the Christmas tree, maybe to that person, maybe they think it's wrong. So it's not going to fit you if you put up one. That person's weak, so we don't want to,
Right.
run them or discourage them or whatever. So just thinking about the Christmas tree this year. When that person becomes strong, when you realize what's what, then maybe they accept it just like you.
Yeah, or don't put it in the window, and then don't invite them over between Thanksgiving and Christmas. If y'all need one, But yeah, that's what he talks about with the food as well, And when I went to my friend's house who's vegan, they offered vegan food the whole time, and I wasn't gonna sneak in, McDonald's in between the meals. I respected their lifestyle choices and ate right along with them.
Brother Jim said he might have had to eat out one night.
Oh yeah, well, if we went to a restaurant, they didn't care what I ordered, but under their roof, when they make the meals, I'm gonna eat bean burritos, and that's their own problem. Yeah. All right, James.
No, that's an interesting point that you made. I understand, being patient, but at what point? Because some of this stuff, just people that have been around for years and years that should have a better understanding, and they still holding to this stuff, even though you show them and you are patient and long-suffering and you try to work with. And it's kind of like at some point, like I'm not gonna be held prisoner because you don't want to, open your mind. I mean, at what point do you draw the line? I'm just saying.
Right. And there are, where Paul drew the line is when the people who were having the limitations made them law. So, and not made them law for themselves, but made them law for everybody else as well. That's where Paul drew the line. The person who ate could still eat. And the person that didn't eat was not supposed to condemn them. The person who kept the day was able to keep the day, and the person who was. So, Paul's not saying to bend over backwards to every single person's little things that they have, but just to be considerate of them. And it goes the other way. They're not supposed to judge you just as you're not supposed to judge them, right? And so if they're not willing to do that, then what are you supposed to do? Because if we followed the will of, when you get down to Romans 14 and all those, to the strictest person, or to the the whiniest person, or whatever, the loudest person, the person who complained the most, who would want to come anywhere, to a church like that? Because that this guy gets his way and he runs everything, and anytime you contradict, he says, well, Romans 14 says that if you think I'm the weaker brother, you got to do what I say, because Paul said, don't offend me. You know what I mean? That could be the, and they might not ever say that, but that could be the attitude that they have. But okay, let's see. James 4, do not speak against one another. It's talking about slander, blaspheme, rumors, gossip, those types of things. He who speaks against a brother or judges his brother speaks against the law and judges the law. But if you judge the law, you're not a doer of the law, but a judge of it. So the law that he would be judging is referenced in verse 12. The very end of the passage, he says, but who are you to judge your neighbor? And so that word neighbor is what gives us that hint. You look back to James 2:8, and he says, if, however, you are fulfilling the royal law according to the scripture, you shall love your neighbor as yourself, you are doing well. And so what he's saying here in verses 11 and 12 is, it's impossible to both love your neighbor as yourself and bring these mean-spirited, evil intention, hostile, arrogant accusations against them. So it's impossible to both love your neighbor as yourself, thus fulfilling the whole law, and to bring these sorts of evil accusations against him. And again, like we said before, you can technically be correct in whatever it is that you're saying, but there's a way in which we have to carry ourselves as Christians. And if you look back to James 3:17 and 18, you'll see what that way is. He says the wisdom from above is first pure, then peaceable, gentle, reasonable, full of mercy and good fruits, unwavering, without hypocrisy, right? And the seed whose fruit is righteousness is sown in peace by those who make peace. And that's a totally different attitude than the way that I've talked before about people, and the lessons that I gave a long time ago, and ways that I thought about people. It didn't line up with what James 3:17 and 18 says, because it didn't come from a place of love and compassion. It came from a judgmental place, wanting to boost my own self up and show that I'm better than everybody else because I got everything technically correct. But what does all this technical correctness matter, this knowledge matter, if you don't know God? And the way that you come to know God is through loving your neighbor as yourself and loving God with all your heart. So James 4:11, he says you become a judge of the law. If you judge the law, you're not a doer of the law, but a judge of it. So it's kind of funny. He basically is saying that this is not necessarily the interpretation of it, but we can totally see this. He says that these people they have all their time consumed by judging one another, that they don't have time themselves to actually practice what the law teaches to do, right? So they spend all their time trying to judge and condemn and get at the other person. They have no time to actually practice the law themselves. So loving their neighbor as himself, not showing partiality towards the rich and the poor there in James chapter 2, caring for the fatherless and the widows in their affliction. If they're so consumed with fighting with one another, what time do they have for all these other, arguably, far more important things, Okay, verse 12, he says, there is only one lawgiver and judge, the one who is able to save and destroy. But who are you to judge your neighbor? So here's another major point in verse 12, and I think a good commentary on this, using the Bible to commentate on itself, would be Matthew 7:1 and following. And Matthew 7:1 and following is a passage that's taken out of context as well. A lot of T-shirts use this passage and things with good intentions, but misguided and not considering what the following passages say. But Matthew 7:1 and following says, do not judge so that you will not be judged. For in the way you judge, you will be judged, and by your standard of measure, it will be measured to you. Why do you look at the speck that is in your brother's eye, but do not notice the log that is in your own eye? Or how can you say to your brother, let me take the speck out of your eye, and behold, the log is in your own eye? You hypocrite, first take the log out of your own eye, and you will see clearly to take the speck out of your brother's eye. So, again, in this passage, he's telling them that the judgment that you use to judge others, that's the same judgment that'll be used to judge you. So let's go back to the example of the man with the Christmas tree. Let's say this man, he doesn't think that you should have a Christmas tree in your house, an ornament, nothing. In fact, when the kids get out of school, he doesn't say it's Christmas break. He calls it winter break or break for the holidays, or something like that. So he doesn't say that word Christmas, right? That man's going to be judged by the judgment that he judges others with, or with which he judges others. And so, if he so happens to let slip, a happy Easter or a Merry Christmas on accident, in other words, he's going to drive himself crazy with that, worrying about Christmas trees and, is he going to go to the bank that has a Christmas tree, or is there another bank that doesn't have a Christmas tree? Maybe like a Jewish bank or something like that, They might have Hanukkah, but at least they're not making up the birth of Jesus, or something like that. But with what judgment you judge, that's what you're going to be judged by. And there's probably a lot of rules that we make up for other people that drive us crazy to follow. In fact, this is kind of what the point that Jesus is making. He says, where is that? And I think it's in Matthew 23 again. But he talks about all these, maybe it's not in Matthew 23. But he talks about all these laws that they make, and they don't even follow them themselves. You recall that passage?
First part of chapter 23.
It is? Okay, that's what I thought, but I wasn't sure. Oh, here we go. Matthew 23 and verse 3. Therefore, all they tell you to do, do and observe, but do not according to their deeds, for they say things and do not do them. They tie up heavy burdens and lay them on men's shoulders, but they themselves are unwilling to move them with so much as a finger. So, that basically sums it up there. When we make all these extra rules that aren't found in the Bible, and it's not that we just follow them because that's what we prefer, but we follow them with the intention of binding them on others and excluding those who do not follow the way that we follow, not the way in the sense of Jesus, but the way in the sense of all the little rules and regulations we've made up for ourselves, then we are doing exactly what James 4:11 and 12 condemn. We are judging others, and we've made ourselves the judge, and we've also made ourselves the lawmaker. And boy, that's going to get us into some trouble, because who can follow all those extra laws that we make up? We have enough in Scripture. We have enough guidelines in Scripture to follow. If we make a bunch of others up and bind them on other people, we're just going to get ourselves into trouble. And Jesus says, my yoke is easy and my burden is light. And if you compare how the word burden is used in Matthew 23, verse 3 and 4, to how Jesus uses in Matthew 11, you see he's talking about his teaching and what he expects out of his followers. And so the Pharisees had all these expectations and all these rules, and so what Jesus is saying, compared to what they have, my burden is light. And we know what the commands of Jesus are, because he gave us the first two right off the bat. He said that the first one was love God with all your heart. The second one was like it, love your neighbor as yourself. And everything else falls within that realm. And so if you follow some of the Pharisees' commands, to broaden their phylacteries and all those, you're no longer loving your neighbor as yourself, right? You're trying to lift yourself up above your neighbor. And so that's where you see their system fall apart. And this is what James is warning against in James 4:11 and 12. He said there's only one lawgiver. So these people were speaking against their brethren, possibly becoming lawgivers in the process, making up rules where there weren't any, or binding rules where God hadn't bound, maybe adhering to some of the Pharisees' teaching or the Sadducees' teaching or whatever. All right? James 4:11 and 12. Anybody have any comments on James 4:11 and 12? We should be able to get through the end of the chapter. Let's go back to verse 13. Okay, we're back into this rich-poor theme that has gone on since the opening passage in James. All right, so this is that same, if you could see my iPad, which I don't have with me, if you could see it, I would have it highlighted green, like I did on the screen a couple weeks ago that you got to see, so that you would see that rich-poor theme throughout this passage. So he says, come now, you who say, today or tomorrow we'll go into such and such city and spend a year there and engage in business and make a profit. Yet you do not know what your life will be like tomorrow. You are just a vapor that appears for a little while, then vanishes away. Instead, you ought to say, if the Lord wills, we will live and also do this or do that. But as it is, you boast in your arrogance. All such boasting is evil. Therefore, to one who knows the right thing to do and does not do it, to him it is sin. So this passage is about these businessmen. They want to go to the city and make a profit. But what they don't consider in their business venture is, how are they going to include God in that plan? How are they going to include the work of the church in that plan? It seems like they have selfish intentions in verse 13, whereas what they should be saying is, how would God want me to go through with this? What would I be able to do with this profit that I make? Would I be able to, assist the fatherless and the widows in their affliction? That man that comes into our services wearing rags, as you see in James chapter 2. Would I be able to help out my brother and look and help out his needs and things like that? So James 4:13 through 17 is not condemning making a profit, because there's nothing inherently wrong with that. God wouldn't have given us talents and the ability to work with our hands and things like that, and Paul wouldn't have lifted a pair of scissors to make his tents and cut his leather, if that were the case. So there's nothing wrong with making money or making a profit. What's wrong is when we do it for selfish reasons and not including God in the plan for those reasons, And so if these two men would have said, let's go make a profit, we have a lot of poor in the city, we can do a lot of good or whatever it is, hey, there we go. But if they said, we need to go make a profit because, well, hey, that makes us look better, and maybe we'll get that good seat there at the church building, from James 2. That's where it falls apart. There's nothing wrong with being materially rich, but what's important is where your true riches lie. Do they lie in heaven, or do they lie on earth? And that's a theme that's carried throughout this book.
That goes against the whole manifestation teaching that's going on now.
What's that?
Just speak it into existence, and it will happen.
Who says that?
First saying you're a millionaire, and then it's gonna happen. That's being taught all over the place. Yeah, speak it into existence.
Really?
Yeah.
Well, I wish I'd have known that. I wouldn't have got a job
Right?
if that worked. Now I heard Think and Grow Rich, the idea that you put it into put it into your mind and focus on it every day and work towards a goal. But
All these prophets and apostles and whatnot are telling people, speak it into existence. You have to claim it. Say it.
well, let's read. You ask and do not receive because you ask with wrong motives, so that you may spend it on your pleasures. Okay, well, I guess that's why that don't
Well,
work.
that's what I told, because our oldest was here visiting, and she was saying that a preacher had said that, and I said, well, what's your motivation behind making a statement like that,
Yeah.
Like the people, it's fine if you feel like you're blessed because you have nice things, but don't think that because you have nice things, that's a sign of you being blessed. Like, a poor person could be just as blessed as you are. It's not about the material, and like, that's the disconnect. Like, people are associating, I have a big house, I have a fancy car, like, I'm blessed.
Right.
So if I don't have a big house and a fancy car, that means I'm not. Like,
Well, that's like how we pray. Let's pray that the hurricane doesn't hit us, and then it goes and hits Mexico. We're like, whew, that was a close one.
yeah, right.
Oh boy,
Yeah.
And that's one way to look at that.
But then that's the motive, though. When you saying we pray that the hurricane don't hit us, you ain't saying let it go over there. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Like, if that was your thought process, then yeah, I'd be like, wait a minute.
I wish every hurricane would do like that one did. Was it last year, the year before, where it went right up and just went off into the ocean? I don't want more to do like that.
Yeah,
And so that kind of gets back into what he means by if the Lord wills, we will live and also do this or that. So he's talking about including God in your plans. When you look at verse 14, a very popular passage, he says, "Yet you do not know what your life will be like tomorrow. You are just a vapor that appears for a little while, then vanishes away." So again, you when you're seeking to make a profit, you have the plan in place. I want this to go. First, obviously, you got to take care of your bills and expenses and things like that. And there's nothing wrong to get something nice for yourself, but you have to have that motive in place. I'm doing this, for God. I'm serving the Lord in what I'm doing. And because you might die tomorrow, then what are all those goods that you got, going to do for you? That goes back to obviously Ecclesiastes. So, verse 17, he says, "Therefore, to one who knows the right thing to do and does not do it, to him it is sin." That's true for verses 13 through 16, including God in your plans. That's true for verses 11 and 12, not judging your brother, in that negative sort of sense. That goes through verses 1 through 10. That's a general rule. If you know what the right thing is to do and you don't do it, that's a sin. Now that verse 17, that is pretty subjective. That's pretty subjective. I might not, if I might know of more opportunities than you do, or you might know more opportunities to do good than I do, or regardless of what it is, if I think it's right and I go against that, that's a sin. And we should be. This goes back to verses 11 and 12 in Romans 14, but we should be conscious of what other people think is right and necessary to do. I think of one situation where someone was very enthusiastic about, doing things for the community, and if to not do that for that person would be a sin, and so we should rally behind that person and help them to do, those things, whatever the situation might be. And so James 4:17 is basically telling us that if you think something is right and it's going to offend your conscience to not do it, that is sin. The Bible might not say, thou shalt do X, Y, and Z, or thou shalt not do X, Y, and Z, But if it's going to offend your conscience, you need to do it, because that's the justification for it right there in verse 17. That kind of goes back to the food in Romans 14. If you think it's right to keep a certain diet and you don't do it, you're sinning against yourself. And remember, the point of sin is not so God has this list of things that you can and can't do, and he's just so offended because you did one of those things. I think God is more hurt by the fact that you are hurting yourself in the things that you do. And so if you set up something that you want to do and you don't do it, you think it's the right thing to do and you don't do it, it's a sin. It's not necessarily because God is angry that you did that thing because you've hurt his pride or whatever. I think it's more that he's angry with you that you've hurt yourself. You know what I mean? Does that make sense? He's upset that you have done harm to yourself or maybe to someone else. I think that's more important to him. So if you say, I'm going to go to Bible class every time the doors are open, and then you skip it for some vain reason, I can't even think of one now, but something that you wanted to do, the water just looked great that day. You just had to, you just wanted to go out there and go for a swim because it was just beautiful and you can't help it or whatever. And you live right by that water every day of your life. This isn't like a special trip, with like a distant relative or somebody you never get to see or something like that. This is something you have like a swimming pool, and just, man, that water looks so good today, so I'm going to skip church this week, and then you skip it the next week. Well, why is God upset with you about that? Because he's taking attendance. That's his job, is to take attendance every Sunday and Wednesday. Or is he upset with you because you made a commitment and you didn't follow through with it, and now you're going to have a guilty conscience and you're just working against yourself, right? And so to the one who knows the right thing to do and does not do it, to him it is sin, okay? And so we ought to do our best to honor that for ourselves and for each other. I think Caden's saying it's about time to be done. His internal clock's pretty good. Hey, today Laura put him in the car, and they came out to Sebring to have lunch with me, and we had a couple errands to run, and he was pitching a fit the whole way, and he fell asleep right before he got right where they were going to eat with me at the barbecue place, and so I was with him the whole time, and then we ran our errands. He slept the whole time. And we put him back in the car, and he went back home with Laura. And I thought, man, he's going to think that she just put him in the car to go ride around. He's not even going to know that he got to go hang out with Dad for for an hour or so. So, all right. Anybody else have any little thing before we finish? Sunday morning, we're going to look more at Matthew chapter 19:9 and Matthew 5:31 and 32. And we'll finish up with that this coming week. And then the next week we'll start looking at Paul in 1 Corinthians chapter 7. Then we'll be done with marriage, divorce, and remarriage. On Sunday evening, we're going to look at the clean and unclean animals in Genesis 6 through 9 and the sacrifice that takes place there. And let's see, that should be about it. Next week we'll look at James 5, 1 through 6. And that'll be